I'm going to start off with a quiz. I was expecting a little bit harsher reaction there. What was our theme last night we talked about? That's right, evolution versus creation. And we looked at 4 major points. Who can tell me what one of those points was? Spontaneous generation? No, we refuted that. That's right, similarity. We looked at similarity. What's another one? Cause and effect, the law of cause and effect. We saw there that God certainly is an adequate cause. Again, you remember what that law says? Every material effect must have an adequate cause. God being almighty would certainly be an adequate cause. We also saw that the cause must be before the effect. It must be greater than the effect, and God fit all of that. What was another one? Similarity, the law of cause and effect, something related to procreation. That's right, the law of biogenesis, simply meaning life begets life of a similar kind. We see that in nature. And what was the final one? That's right, we looked at the fossil record. And what do we find in the fossil record? Nothing to support evolution, that's right. We saw a lot of complex forms that were complete. And then we even saw some evidence, too, of, remember, the polystrate fossils that intersected multiple strata. Evolutionists would have us to believe that those strata were laid down over millions of years of time. And yet we find things like tree trunks and preserved skeletons with soft tissue in them that just cannot be explained with a large passage of time. All right, now we're going to back up a little bit more into the past. What did we talk about Sunday night? Sunday night, what was our theme? Remember? Something that starts with a D. Design demands a designer. That's right. Design demands a designer. And we looked at 3 particular areas. One of them was the animal kingdom. How many of you had a chance to go on YouTube and check out the bombardier beetle? Any of you look at him yet? Go do that. Do that this week. Look at the amazing creature that he is and what God has given him the ability to do. And we also looked at the human body. What was the other thing that we looked at? The universe. Everything that we have in the universe, and our universe is pretty good size, isn't it? We threw a lot of big numbers at you, but that just shows the grand magnitude and the scale of it. Well, tonight, we're going to look at evolutionary hoaxes. And for those of you that have not seen this slide yet, or perhaps are online that haven't seen it, I just want you to be aware most of this material does come from the AP Teen Adult Manual, although I have added some of my own material and arranged it in a manner that I think we can all benefit from. Well, I have 2 more memory verses, or at least verses that you should mark in your Bible that are themed toward this. The first is Exodus 20 and verse 11. There Moses records, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day, wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." So in this one verse we have creation really kind of summarized. And I like that verse very much for that reason. The other one that I've added is 1 John 4 and verse 1. We're going to see why this is relevant as we study together tonight. It says, "Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world." And we're going to see, again, why that is so relevant to this particular topic. The first question we need to ask is, what is a hoax? How would you define it? A hoax. I know we've heard that term before. Yeah, I gave you a bit of a clue, didn't I? It's a lie, if you really boil it down. Merriam-Webster defines the word hoax as to trick into believing or accepting as genuine something false and often preposterous. We have here Bigfoot crossing. Now, people believe he exists. Who, we have to ask the question, would want to do something like this? Who would want to be involved with such things as hoaxes? Well, we don't have to get very far in the New Testament to find out. Satan is the master of all hoaxes. Jesus tells us who is behind every single falsehood in John chapter 8, verse 44. There, in rebuking the scribes and the Pharisees, he says, "Ye are of your father the devil, and the lust of your father ye will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it." What is Satan's wheelhouse? Deception, lies, things that are false. Well, God is the master of all. The psalmist wrote of God and His Word in Psalm 119 and 104. I know you know this verse. "Through thy precepts I get understanding, therefore I hate every false way." What does God think about things that are false? He hates them. He despises them. Solomon would write in Proverbs 6, verses 16 through 19, "These 6 things doth the Lord hate," there's our word, "yea, 7 are an abomination unto Him." You know what that word abomination means? You heard that described to you before? I'll give you a clue. I have a room upstairs, a laundry room, and within it there's a trash can. And that trash can houses diapers. Not new diapers, old diapers, used diapers. And at the end of the week, I have the pleasure of taking out the trash. I open that up, and guess what I get? An abomination. I get a stench in my nostrils. That's what an abomination. God finds these things repulsive to Him. Well, what are they? A proud look, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, and heart that deviseth wicked imaginations, feet that be swift in running to mischief, a false witness that speaketh lies. There's deception. And he that soweth discord among brethren. Now, we as creationists, those that believe in the Bible, that believe in God, we align ourselves with God. And what is our goal as Christians? What are we trying to spread to others? Truth. We're trying to spread the truth. We ask the question, what of the evolutionists? What are they trying to accomplish? So let's look at some evolutionary hoaxes. And the first thing we want to look at is some bad science. As I have alluded to, there is such things as true science. There's also false science. Well, there's also bad science. How many of you have heard of Haeckel's embryos before? You've heard of them. Probably heard from AP before. In the mid-1800s, this fella, he's a German anatomist. That means he studies anatomy. Ernst Haeckel became famous for advocating that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And I'll try saying that 5 times fast. That simply means ontogeny is the development of a single individual. Recapitulates, that's repeats. And phylogeny is the development of an entire group. So the basic idea he's setting forth is that watching the development of an embryo of a human or any other type of creature repeats every single stage in its evolutionary process. So it starts off as a one-cell organism. Just like its amoeba-like ancestor, they say, it then develops gills like its fish ancestors. It has a tail like its ape-like ancestor. And looking at this, we're supposed to envision kind of a still picture of what evolution really is, a person's evolutionary ancestry. So if you haven't seen it before, this is what he came up with. And over here you have a fish, you have a salamander, you have a bird, I believe, you have a pig, you have a sheep. Eventually you get over here to the human. And you notice, pretty similar looking, isn't it? So again, his name might be, or may not be familiar to you, but this diagram might be. It's in a number of books that teach on biology and other things. Now, this single figure that we have here is supposed to be one of the best known proofs of evolution, but it has a teeny tiny little problem with it. You know what it is? It's fake. Not only was Haeckel an anatomist, he was an artist too. So he took some liberties, we might say, with this particular diagram. He actually used his artistic abilities to falsify some of these drawings which accompanied the research with the animal and the human embryos in order to make it appear like embryonic recapitulation was true. But even the modern evolutionists we have today admit that his drawings are inaccurate. In no way does this prove evolution. Well, let's also talk about some DNA, and specifically some chimpanzee DNA. How many of you have heard that we evolved from apes? Yeah, we've heard it, haven't we? And they get that from DNA. Many years, evolutionists have claimed that chimpanzees and humans were so similar that we could be considered kissing cousins. I don't know about you. I really don't want to kiss an ape. Anyway, though, those same evolutionists are very quick to point out that the DNA in humans is almost an identical match to the DNA found in monkeys. Now, DNA is the genetic material inside a living cell. It's short for deoxyribonucleic acid. And there's also a subcomponent to that called RNA. That's just the ribonucleic acid. Very, very complex things that are going on here, sending genetic information. There's a lot of different triggers in that. So up until about 2002, almost any textbook you open reported that humans and chimpanzees were 98 to 99% genetically similar. And if you go on the internet right now, I did this today and looked up, how similar are chimpanzees and humans' DNA, you're still going to find a number about that high. But scientists, not all of them, but some of the good ones, are finding that there are more differences in DNA from humans and apes. In fact, a 2002 research study showed that human DNA was at least 5% different from chimpanzees. So we knocked that down to 95%. And as they learn more about DNA and how these things are structured, that number will probably continue to increase. Well, let's think about this critically, logically, rationally. Does it make sense that humans share so much DNA with chimpanzees and apes and other similar type animals? What do you think? That makes sense? God created both of them. Do we have some similar structures? Yeah, we have some similar structures, don't we? Consider this. Humans and chimps are mammals. We possess similar or same type of internal organs. Now, it doesn't mean they're exactly the same, but they're similar. Humans and chimpanzees, we both eat fruits and vegetables, or at least we should, right? Mom always told us to eat our vegetables, which means our mouths, our digestive systems have to share some of those similar characteristics. You remember last night that similarity not only shows ancestry from time to time, what else does it show? Common design. Remember similar type environments, similar type animals living in those environments? Same type of thing we see here. Humans and chimpanzees get their sensory information from their eyes, their ears, their nose, their fingers. In fact, chimpanzees have learned sign language. They can communicate with that. So it would make perfect sense that their DNA has a lot of similarities, but so do many other animals. Well, homology does not prove common ancestry. We looked at that last night. Again, homology, just a simple or really a complicated word for similarity. Out of the 5,000 best-known human genes, 75%, that's 3/4, have matches in this guy right here, the nematode worm. Now, does that mean that we are 75% identical to that? You know what I want to use this for? I want to put a hook in him and go out to the lake and catch some fish. Who would believe that humans are anywhere close to being identical to this? And yet, most of the structure there in the human genes are identical to that. Well, why is that? Just because living creatures share some genes with humans certainly does not mean that they have a linear ancestry. In fact, when you think about it, there is a lot of difference between humans and apes. Let's consider them. Have you heard a chimpanzee talk? They just speak in English, or sing a song, or write a poem. Do chimpanzees build large buildings or computers? Do chimpanzees wear clothes and tennis shoes? Now, I'm going to say this, on their own. I know I've seen people dress them up. Both humans and chimpanzees have hair, but chimps have it all over their bodies. And I'll also interject, sometimes humans do too. Not me, of course. The skin of chimpanzees comes in only one color. Did you know that? Only one color. But what about human? We have different colors of skin, don't we? Multiple colors. Yellows, browns, whites, and reds. And here's an important question. How many chimpanzees do you know that worship Almighty God? Let's break this down. If we took all of the DNA from every cell every cell and then compared that in the DNA of monkeys, so we're comparing our DNA with the DNA of monkeys, the 4 to 5% difference in DNA would represent approximately 200 million differences. That's not a small number, is it? Let me make that a little bit more clearer. Consider the fact that if evolutionists had to pay you just 1 penny for every difference, you'd walk away with $2 million. That number doesn't sound so small, does it, that 4 to 5%? We know man is the only creature that is made in the spiritual image and likeness of God. We used this passage last night, Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27. So God created man in His own image. In the image of God created He him, male and female created He them. We are different from the animals, aren't we? We have an eternal spirit. Chimpanzees are simply animals that share some physical similarities with man. Well, how many of you have heard of the Miller experiment? Now, Stanley Miller was a scientist. A fair amount of science textbooks printed within about the last 50 years have this experiment from 1953, and it leaves the impression that scientists were able to create life from non-living substances. Now here is what his experiment did. He took a system of flasks. He attempted to simulate early atmospheric conditions, so he just wanted to simulate what the atmosphere was made of. What he did was he took an electric spark through a mixture that contained water. We know water is comprised of hydrogen and oxygen, ammonia, methane, and hydrogen. So he's got some liquid components, he's got some gas components. However, there was one gas he left out, oxygen. Why do you think he left oxygen out of the experiment? Well, what does oxygen usually do with proteins and other things? What does it do in general? It oxidizes things. It breaks things down. At the bottom of the apparatus that he had a trap to capture any of the molecules. So he's going to shock these things. He's going to capture everything in kind of a trap door. And that trap also prevented the newly formed chemicals from being zapped with the next electrical charge. So that's the setup that we have in this experiment. So he was able to produce a mixture containing 2 simple amino acids. And amino acids are what a protein gets broken down into. The experiment, however, did not produce any of the fundamental building blocks of life itself. So what did it create? Well, 85%, most of it, was tar. What is tar? Sludge. It's this black stuff over here. We read about tar pits. How conducive is that for life? Well, it also created 13% carbolic acid. You know what carbolic acid is? Incredibly toxic, incredibly corrosive. Not very good things for life, is it? And here we go. Here's some elements. A little over 1% glycine, that's an amino acid, and not quite 1% alanine, which is an amino acid. And then trace amounts, smaller amounts of other chemicals. So the bulk of what he created was some serious waste product that is not conducive to life. Only 2 small organic compounds were created in this test, and we know that many more are necessary for life. In fact, Miller failed at forming life. He did not form it. He produced only tiny building blocks. Under the right conditions, these things can form life. Well, let me give you an analogy. This is like trying to build a house out of a bunch of chemicals. Can you imagine that? Shock those chemicals, you produce clay. Sometimes you can take that clay and you can make bricks, which you could then fashion into a house. But have you proven that you can build a house from a bunch of chemicals by doing that? Absolutely not. All you have proven is that those chemicals can form clay. Consider this, it takes a very important or intelligent person to form clay into bricks, and an even more intelligent person to be able to arrange those into a building. But here's the major problem. Remember oxygen? What was that in his experiment? Did he have it in there? He didn't. He cut it out. Why did he cut it out? Well, it's in our atmosphere, isn't it? In fact, 21% of our atmosphere is made of oxygen. What would happen if we didn't have oxygen in our atmosphere? We would die. We need it, don't we? We talked about on Sunday night blood. And one of the key things that blood does with oxygen is what? It moves it around the body so that we can stay alive. Other creatures need it. Fish need it. They extract it with their gills from the water. Oxygen is a key part of life, and yet he didn't have it as an experiment. Why did he not have oxygen in his experiment? What did he know? Oxygen breaks down chemicals. That's what it does. In fact, you can read about what happens to amino acids when they're oxidized. They get turned into acid. Keto diets. Have you ever heard of keto diets before? Keto diets, they break down amino acids into keto acids that the body then burns when it doesn't have carbohydrates. Oxygen is a key part of that. If he had put it in his experiment, immediately that oxygen would have attacked it. It would have killed whatever was created. We know today that the Earth's atmosphere contained oxygen when evolution thought that life formed supposedly billions of years ago. They acknowledged oxygen was in the atmosphere. Yet if there was oxygen in the atmosphere, we evolved from these single-cell organisms, amino acids, these non-living type chemicals, then oxygen would have done what to them? It would have destroyed them. He knew that oxygen would destroy his experiment, so that's exactly why he didn't use it. He would have failed right off the bat. Stanley Miller's experiment did not prove that life comes from non-living chemicals. In fact, what he sought to prove proved just the opposite. Don't you hate when that happens? Something blows up in your face. Life could not have evolved in an environment that contained oxygen. That is a key point. Let's conclude bad science. Stanley Miller is an intelligent man. In fact, a lot of these scientists are incredibly well-learned men. And they do similar type experiments. They've spent not 10 hours or 50 hours or hundreds of hours, but thousands of hours coming up with these ideas, trying to take non-living chemicals and turn them into life. And you know how much success they've had? Zero. Goose egg. None. They believe that in nature, though, that life came from non-living chemicals by accident. They believe that. And it's taken them thousands of hours to try and produce life, and what have they accomplished? Well, they made some tar, I guess. Does it make sense to believe that this happened by accident in nature? Is that logical? Is that rational? If these intelligent men who are trying to produce life cannot do it, why should we be led to believe that nature somehow did it by accident? Well, we know what the truth is. God created all living things in 6 days. Life did not form slowly over millions of years. Life did not accidentally pop up from non-living chemicals. Well, let's also look at some failed icons of evolution. So these are some examples that evolutionists have propped up to be a support for their doctrine. How many of you have heard of peppered moths before? I know you have. You got to see my slides before you guys did, so. Images of light and dark colored moths in school textbooks, they've been a chief icon of evolution. In fact, you can go online. I researched on Berkeley, one of the universities we have here. They still reference these moths. The story that commonly accompanies the picture revolves around the Industrial Revolution in England. At that point in time, these light-colored, speckled gray moths were very common. They allowed themselves to camouflage amongst the light-colored lichen on the trees, and they said that made them nearly invisible to hungry birds, so they're camouflage, a great thing in nature. But a dark form also existed, but this moth was said to be rare as it stood out on the lichen-colored trees. And of course, it would have been easily spotted by birds. They would have ate it. So we see one is camouflaged, one is not. Now, the textbooks point to pollution as the trigger for an evolutionary change in these moths. The industrial factories in England, what did they start producing, do you suppose? Smog, soot, black things out of the smokestack. And so what would that do to the trees around them? Well, it would coat them in this soot, in the black. So the light-colored moths now become what? Much more visible. On a black or a dark tree, white's going to stand out, isn't it? And the dark moths, oh, they're going to blend in. And in only a few years, the population of light and dark moths had reversed itself, with the black moths greatly outnumbering the white moths. So, aha! According to the evolutionists, this change in the moth population proves that a species can evolve different characteristics that allow them to survive. Now, what did we say about these moths and when they existed? Remember? Was it before the Industrial Revolution? The problem with this proof of evolution is that the images were faked and the experiments were artificial. Peppered moths don't rest on tree trunks under normal circumstances, but they hide themselves. Does that make sense? They're going to get themselves as far away from a predator as they possibly could. The photographed moths were actually arranged in a stage setting. Listen to this. This is so interesting. Dead moths were either pinned or glued to the tree trunks, or captured moths were then forced to stay there. Try and picture this in your mind. You have people out here with a bunch of moths. They're gluing them on the trees. They're putting some live ones on there and trying to wrangle them in there and say, okay, take the picture now. Take it now. Current research has debunked the peppered moth incident as a legitimate example of Darwinian natural selection. Well, natural selection does take place in the wild. In fact, this would be a great example, really, of micro-type evolution, variations within a species. But macroevolution says that variation can happen amongst the species and in between the species. We see here that obviously the dark moth was much more blended in, so they were able to survive and reproduce, and genetically you would get more dark moths. Well, that's why the population shifted themselves, not because of evolution. Now I'm going to interject something here. Santa squirrel. How many of you have heard of Santa squirrel before? Well, you probably haven't heard of him because that's the nickname that my family gave him. In their backyard, they discovered an incredibly rare white squirrel. This is actually a gray squirrel by name, but he's white. So there you go for names sometimes. From untamedscience.com, here's the explanation for this phenomenon. And I quote, "For some odd reason, eastern gray squirrels in the U.S. do have a gene," so there's our genetics, DNA, "that will make their coats white. It's somewhat rare to see a white squirrel, though, because white squirrels are likely highly selected against. In other words, predators to squirrels, such as hawks, really like it when their prey is highlighted white. They don't blend in anymore, do they, on the dark-colored trees? So is this evolution at work? Or is this a bad mutation? What do you think? Yeah, albino. And actually, there are two variants of this. You have the albino one, that the customary red eyes, and then you have those that have the dark eyes, which I think is what this one is, but has a white coat. So the only difference is the color of his coat. Now we have to remember that evolution purports that many good mutations must have taken place over a long period of time. And really, when you start thinking about natural selection, it's talking about those traits and characteristics that benefit the species. Those things that don't benefit it make it more vulnerable to species that are less, or species that are stronger in the environment that would then kill off that particular species, and they wouldn't be able to reproduce, and you'd have less of them eventually, would become extinct. So natural selection is always purporting good mutations. What about this guy? Well, unfortunately for Santa squirrel, his mutation was bad. It's probably going to result in him becoming prey. Please don't tell my children or the other children. Now, what happened with the peppered moths wasn't even this complicated. Dark moths and light moths, remember, have always been around. They existed. They were already there before the Industrial Revolution. There was no new genetic material created to form a black moth. Well, what does evolution say? There has to be new material. There has to be new genetics. This textbook story is nothing more than gene frequencies shifting back and forth by natural selection between populations. So again, we're talking about that microtype evolution. It remains, however, a single created kind. These moths didn't evolve into spiders. They didn't turn into cats. They didn't turn into humans. But yet they are used as a proof for evolution. This moth hates spiders. Now let's talk about Darwin's finches. Now the Galapagos Island is a place with a fair amount of finches, birds. And these birds, which you may have seen this chart before, have become somewhat of a mascot for evolutionists. It is popularly believed that Darwin discovered 13 species of finches on his voyage in the HMS Beagle. So when he is going about writing his book, Origin of the Species, he's on an expedition. And that's the ship that he has there. And that helped him influence the development, or use the development of his history, or the theory rather, of evolution by natural selection. So these birds were said to help him along with that. I find this interesting. Darwin, though, actually found 9 species on the trip, and only 6 of them were actually finches. So there's even some error in that. He took little note of the birds while on the island, only a passing mention in his field notebook. So a fellow by the name of David Lax, in a 1947 book, Darwin's Finches, is the one that really got these birds their legendary type status, and not Darwin's own research, and yet they're still called Darwin's finches. Well, here's what evolutionists suggest. They suggest that the different beak sizes of these finches change in proportion to climate and food availability. And over time, these changes accumulate on top of each other, and then we get new species. The diversity of finches on the islands often has been hailed as a great proof of evolution. Again, we see this bird over here, labeled number 4, has a very tiny beak. Number 3, slightly shorter, getting a little bit fatter. Number 2, getting a lot fatter. Number 1, a lot bigger, a lot fatter. And they're saying these finches are evolving. But more recent research has shown that the characteristics of finches don't evolve but oscillate. All that word oscillate means is it goes back and forth. It varies within itself. They develop these stouter beaks right here that we see on the top during dry periods. Why do you think that would be the case? What happens when things are dry? Yeah, they get hard, don't they? We experience that right now, don't we? You think about the nuts and the food that they eat would be very hard. Well, how does a bird go about cracking a nut? He uses his beak, doesn't he? So a stouter beak would benefit him in getting food. The ones with the smaller beaks wouldn't be able to get as much food, maybe would reach a point where they couldn't reproduce. So you get stouter beaked finches. Now when the rains return, birds with slighter beaks are favored. So now that the rains are back, what would the food be like? It'll be a lot easier to get into. It would be soft fruits, things like that. So those stouter beaks would be more forceful for the bird. They'd have to carry around more weight. They wouldn't be as popular. Rather than gradually evolving from one kind to another, the finches actually vary within defined limits of one another. The finches might have larger beaks. The finches might have smaller beaks. But guess what the finches always had? Beaks. They always had beaks. So here's a reality check for evolution. The finches' beaks did not change into a muzzle with teeth. The finches' beaks did not change into a scaly lizard mouth like this guy has. And for the past 160 years since Darwin was there, people have been studying these birds. And guess what? They still have beaks to this day. Most important, the finches never change into anything other than finches. Of those 13 species, which again, we whittle those down actually to 6, if they came from one flock even, they were still finches. They were still that one species. None of them has changed into a crow or a snake, a dolphin or a dog. Guess what? In 160 years, what do they change into? Finches. They're just finches. The only thing that Darwin's finches prove is that a finch always stays a finch, even though you have some variation. Now we see that variation in other creatures too, don't we? How many different dog breeds do we have today? In fact, people, we'll talk about birds, actually breed different type of pigeons. They have competitions to see what kind of features they can grow on them. They're actually using genetics to do that, but it's still a pigeon, isn't it? They're using the diversity that they have within the species, that microtype evolution. Well, let's talk about horse evolution as well. How many of you have heard of Hyracotherium? Yeah, he's an interesting guy. One of the most commonly used proofs of evolution is a series of horse-like animals. And here's an artist's rendition of what they look like. Kind of looks like a deer, fox. Looks like he's got a lion's tail. I mean, it's just a hodgepodge of things. In fact, that's what they did with the fossils. They just took a bunch of different fossils, hodgepodge of fossils rather, and then they claimed that the modern horse can be traced back to this tiny four-toed fox-like animal, which they named Hyracotherium, also sometimes called Eohippus. They say that this guy lived about 60 million years ago. Supposedly, this animal started out only 24 inches tall, so he's just a little guy, just 2 feet tall. He evolved into the modern-day horse, which we know as Equus. And in the process, he lost some things. He lost his toes, traded them for hoofs. Here's the problem with this theory. There's a proof. I need some proof. There isn't. The fossil record, as we looked at last night, doesn't show a sequence of transitional type fossils. It doesn't do it for horses. It doesn't do it for any type of species. The horse series was constructed from fossils found in many different parts of the world, and get this, they don't even fit together. You'd think if you're going to try and construct something, try and prove a point, you at least try and find the ones that fit together. Not the case. The creatures that certain science textbooks identify as belonging to the horse family show absolutely no ancestor-descendant relationship. In fact, in some cases, they have different numbers of ribs and vertebrae, but yet they were supposed to have evolved from one another? Nonsense. Well, this fox-like animal named Hyracotherium, which is supposedly the great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of the horse, has no more resemblance to the horse than it does any other four-legged animal that feeds on vegetation. Now, I love this quote that's coming up. How many of you know of George Gaylord Simpson? He is a very famous evolutionist of last century, the 20th century. He admitted that the case for horse evolution is non-existent, and I quote, "The uniform, continuous transformation of Hyracotherium into Equus, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature." Never happened. Horses have always been horses. So off goes Hyracotherium with his friend the unicorn. God designed the horse, and in his response to Job out of the whirlwind. And I hope you've been looking at Job chapter 38 through 40. You remember your homework assignment? I haven't forgotten. In verses 19 through 25, notice what God said about the horse. He said, "Hast thou given the horse strength? Hast thou clothed his neck with thunder? Canst thou make him afraid as a grasshopper? The glory of his nostrils is terrible. He paweth in the valley and rejoiceth in his strength. He goeth on to meet the armed men. He mocketh at fear and is not affrighted. Neither turneth he back from the sword. The quiver rattleth against him, the glittering spear and the shield. He swalloweth the ground with fierceness and rage. Neither believeth he that it is the sound of the trumpet. He saith among the trumpets, Ha ha! And he smelleth the battle afar off, the thunder of the captains and the shouting." What does this describe about a horse? Just the fierceness of him. You can imagine these armies with horse riders. You're not afraid. And we're supposed to believe that a horse came from this tiny little punk, I'll say. It's like, seriously. Now, these are but a few of the icons of evolution which have been proven false. Now, we know in some cases what is used to show evolution is actually a better proof for creation and intelligent design. Oftentimes, again, as we pointed out last night, it's not the data, the facts that are in question, it's how they are interpreted. People have this idea about evolution, and they try and get the facts to fit evolution any way that they can instead of looking at creation and that the facts line up with one another so well. I'm going to stop right there because I think we're pretty close to break time. And when we get back from the break, we're going to look at some missing links. But something's wrong with the missing links. They're missing. Any questions or thoughts or comments before I turn you loose for some sugar? Not, I appreciate you all very much, and we'll see you back here after a few minutes. working okay, Jeff? Was it? I wonder maybe. What's that? I have it over here, but I can leave it on. Yeah, I can leave my phone over here. I don't need it. Put it up here. I'll just leave it over here. All right. I think we'll go ahead and get started back. They have a few that will be coming here a little bit later. Talking to Robert in the break, I know I had mentioned the term microevolution, but a better term to use would actually be gene frequency. So that's really what I was trying to describe. We don't want to give evolutionists any kind of foothold. So apologize for using that term. And really what we want to use is gene frequencies. Again, we know God created everything in 6 days, including the genetic information that we find in ourselves and in other organisms. So what you're seeing is just different genes being turned on, different sequences, things of that are varying within that same species. So I want to clarify that, and certainly clarify that for the online viewing audience as well. Again, when we're dealing with evolutionists, others that don't believe in the Bible, we need to use terms that don't give them any sort of advantage whatsoever over us, because we have the truth. We don't have to be ashamed of the truth. I remember Paul in Romans mentioning he's not ashamed of the gospel of Christ and the power of it, and we don't have to be either. So now, without further ado, we're going to look at some missing links. So these are things that evolution has purported as, aha, we got it, here is the missing link. But what we've been able to find is not the case. How many of you have heard of Nebraska Man before? Yeah, Nebraska Man. This is an older one. In June 24th, 1922, Illustrated London News presented on its front cover, what you're seeing right here, a man and a woman that had been fabricated from a single tooth. So you have a tooth. Just imagine a tooth. I think we have a dentist that goes to this congregation, don't we? Dr. Jared? Yeah, my kids love him. And we know what teeth are, a single tooth. And from this, here we go. We have a man here. He's got some kind of a tool in his hand. There's his wife doing the dishes, I guess. I'm not sure what she's doing. You got camels back here. You got animals. I mean, you have a whole environment, a whole scene that is constructed from this tooth right here that I'm pointing to with this red arrow and this green dot. Well, Henry Fairfield Osborn, the head of the Department of Paleontology at New York's famed American Museum of Natural History, he took that tooth and he ran with it. He wanted to enter it as evidence for evolution in the 1925 Scopes monkey trial. But just 2 years later from that, scientists had concluded, and they were pretty begrudging about it, that in fact the tooth was that of a species of Prosthenops, which is an extinct genus related to the modern wild pig. It was a pig tooth, and it was extinct at that. Missing link? No, we don't have one here. But just notice how quick they're to take a tiny little piece of supposed evidence and fabricate this whole big story behind it. And that's not going to happen just once, incidentally. Well, how many of you have heard of Piltdown Man? We mentioned him, I think, yesterday. In 1912, Charles Dawson, not to be confused with Darwin, as I've gone over these slides, I keep wanting to say Darwin, but I said it right that time. A medical doctor he was and an amateur paleontologist. He discovered a mandible and a portion of a skull in a gravel pit in Piltdown, England. Now, what is a mandible? Yeah, it's a jaw. It's a jawbone. So he's got a part of a skull and a jawbone. Now, Arthur Smith Woodward, director of the Natural History Museum of London, announced the find. Here it is. The missing link. We got it. The jawbone appeared very simian-like. So what's a simian? Yeah, it's an ape. It's an ape, exactly. So that jawbone, whoa, this might be part man, part ape. This is it, right? This is the missing link. Except for something was going on with the teeth. Why is it always the teeth, it seems like? It showed the type of wear expected of humans and not apes. Well, 1953, so this one took a little bit longer to be exposed, but it was exposed as a forgery. The skull was human, but that mandible was ape. They got it from an ape. And it had been intentionally filed down the teeth on that mandible and treated biochemically. That is, they put chemicals on the teeth to make it appear like it was old. They're fabricating something. This deception did far more than dupe a few evolutionists, a few scientists, because the whole world was taken. People believed this. Museums worldwide displayed the copies and the photographs of the Piltdown remains, and for 40 years, this find was pronounced as the ape-like ancestor to modern mankind. But what was it in reality? It was a fabrication. It was a fraud. No missing link here. How many of you have heard of Orsay Man before? Or Orsay, depending on what side of the border you're on. In 1982, a team of 3 Catalan archaeologists, so these a little bit more recent in time, headed by Professor José Guibert, was digging near the village of Orsay in Spain. Now, during that dig, they uncovered a very unusual bone fragment. It's kind of hard to see, but it's what's resting on top of this skull fragment right here. Now, a year later, they announced that that fragment belongs to a human child. And, well, you can imagine the uproar that caused in the evolutionary community, and it did. This discovery placed humans in Europe far earlier than evolutions had ever predicted. So now they're saying, well, humans, maybe they're a little bit older than what we think. Based upon this find, some overeager scientists, here they go again, guess what they did? They reconstructed an entire human from this. Orsay Man, as the find came to be known, was said to represent the oldest human fossil ever discovered in Europe. But later on, to the embarrassment of many, the bone was identified more accurately as the skull cap of a 6-month-old donkey. Now we read about the donkey in Job chapter 39. What is the donkey well known for? Stubbornness. Even in death, they're pretty stubborn, aren't they? You think about this poor little 6-month-old donkey lost his skull cap. He's still causing problems for humans. No missing link here. Now, how many of you have heard of Lucy? This one's pretty famous. Yeah, we've heard of Lucy before. Now, for many years, Lucy was touted as the missing. This is it. This is the missing link. This is the creature that proved humans evolved from ape-like creatures. This is a replica of the skull. They've actually made this into a figure, gave it skin, all of those fun things. And scientists maintain that Lucy walked upright like a human and was thus well on her way to becoming one. Since her discovery, though, we have learned that her fingers and toes are curved, and she has ape-like limb proportions. Humans do not possess these anatomical features, but apes do. Lucy's rib cage is shaped like that of a chimp rather than a human. You notice a trend here? In addition, men have examined her wrists and discovered that she had the ability to lock them. And can we do that with our wrists? And this is very common for animals that walk on all fours, quadrupeds. That's what apes do. They walk on all fours until it's time to go swinging. Furthermore, the circular canals located within the ears of her alleged species, well, we analyze those too. They're oriented in a different direction from humans, and not only that, they are a different size from humans. Scientists tried everything they know to figure out, and I love this so much, how Lucy could have given birth to an infant, but her pelvis was too small, which likely indicates it wasn't a female. It's actually a male fossil that they had. They didn't even get the name right. Lucius is what they should have called it. All of these scientific proofs indicate that Lucy was nowhere close to becoming human, didn't get the gender. In fact, when you look at the evidence, what is Lucy? It's a tree-swinging ape is what it is. No missing link here. I want you to notice in each one of the examples how eager was man to accept them, to run with them, to create something with them. Pretty eager, weren't they? They were out to try and find the missing link. This is it. We have our proof for evolution. Yet in these 4 examples that we looked at, what was the final result? They were false. They were misconceptions. They were deception. Now here's where 1 John chapter 4 and verse 1 comes into play. John would write there, "Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world." What is John saying to Christians here? What is his message in this passage? First off, don't believe everything you hear. Second off, do what? Prove it. Put it to the test. What is the ultimate standard that we have? The Bible. Do these things line up with what the Bible has to say? I know that's talking about false doctrine, but how do you want to classify evolution? What is it? It's false doctrine. It's a teaching. That's what doctrine is. So here we go, some discussion questions. Many of the evolutionary evidences, and I put that in quotations there, discussed in this lesson are still used in textbooks and on the internet as well. Textbooks we sometimes are thinking now a little more outdated as we have the internet. Even though these things have been disproved. We looked at 4 examples that have been disproved, and yet some of those are still in textbooks. Why do you think evolutionary textbooks perpetuate these myths? They're false. They're proven false. Why are they still there? Got to hold on to something? People want evolution to be true, don't they? They want it to be true. And as we mentioned last night, one of the reasons for that, they want to deny the responsibility to God. We think about how much money is tied up into evolution. There's a lot out there. You think about all these different museums. I was talking with Robert Lukenbill last night. All these natural museums, all of these things that are dedicated to what? Science and evolution. Now you think about, oops, we made a mistake. Evolution's not true. Creation's actually true. We've got to remodel all these things. Well, who's going to pay for that? So they try as hard as they can to keep these things going, to perpetuate the myths. Now, oftentimes, evolutionists will give facts, but they'll do it in a not so forthcoming way, perhaps even deceptive. Do you think evolutionists really want to deceive people, or do they just really want evolution to be true? What do you think? Both? Yeah, when you're purporting a false doctrine, you're not really being honest, are you? Now, you can be honestly wrong, I suppose. There's people that can certainly believe in something and think it to be the truth, but they're wrong in it. But when we see these various evidences here that prove these things incorrect and they still purport it as being true, they must want to deceive people. Now, in view of all of these hoaxes and deceptions, how should a Christian evaluate new evidence, such as a new missing link? And I listed 4, or we had 4 here, but there will be another one down the road, I assure you. How should we evaluate this new evidence that evolutionists claim supports their theory? That's right. Prove all things, to try the Spirit. So we listen to it, we use our brains, we think rationally, we think logically as we introduce this on Sunday. And we prove it. We look at it and say, does this make sense? Is this rational? Is this in accordance with the Bible? Or is it in conflict with it? Exactly. Try the spirits. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 1. Now, can you think of other evidences that you have seen used to teach evolution that you know to be false? Carbon dating? Yeah, that's a good one. And I'm glad you brought that up. I need to correct one thing, too. I said last night my son was 3 years old, and he's actually 2. He'll be 3 in August, so my dating method's off, too, a little bit. But anyway, the carbon dating method, the radioisotope system that they use, and for those of you that aren't aware, what they do is they basically examine a rock or whatever, and they examine the type of breakdown in that rock of certain materials. They know certain radioactive materials break down to other types of materials. They know the half-life of that, and so they extrapolate that out to date things. Well, they've been able to take certain rocks that they know formed at a certain period of time, subjected to those tests, and you know what those tests say as far as the age of those rocks? Yeah, they're a whole lot older than what they actually are. So what does that tell us about those methods? There's got to be a flaw in them. And what those methods assume is that the system in which they're measuring is closed. Well, we have a rock here that is out in the environment. Is that a closed system? Absolutely not. Who's to say that other elements couldn't impact that rock, or certain other elements could take those elements out of the rock and skew the results? And there's real-world examples of these dating methods that are supposed to be consistent with one another, different materials, and they give radically different dates. Some say, oh, well, this one's 600 million years old. Another one says it's 1.5 billion years old. Same rock. Can't be, can it? It's a contradiction. So there's some work to be done there. And as I mentioned as well, Mount St Helens, that happened fairly recently. And if you went out to that site, you examined it, or even go on the internet and look at it, for the untrained mind, if you didn't know when it happened, you would think, well, maybe this happened over a slow period of time with erosion or what have you. But yet, what do we know took place to cause all of those different formations and the things that happened there? A catastrophic event, a volcano that erupted, and similar events that happened afterwards. Well, what do we know took place in Genesis chapter 6 and following? A catastrophic event. And in a supplement to the Is Genesis History documentary, there was actually a particular lake. I was talking with some folks about this last night, that was to the point where they had to open the spillway. And this spillway was very large, very thick concrete. In fact, I think this concrete was something like 60 feet thick. They opened up that spillway, and the force of the water cut through it like butter. It actually bored through the concrete and started tearing the earth away. And you think about the destructive nature of water. Now, ratchet that up to a global scale, and what do you get? Think about it. Well, another thing evolution will teach is that humans are not higher or more evolved than any other living lineages. Have you ever seen the tree, the evolution tree? They won't call it a ladder where humans are at the pinnacle, which is really what creation teaches outside of God. We were there as far as creation goes, and we were to subdue the animals. We had the dominion over the animals. God had placed us there. But of course, we're under God. But evolution says, no, we're all in these trees. We're interlinked with one another. Man's really not any higher or more evolved than any other living lineage. Well, we know that's not true. Genesis 1 and verse 28. All right. Do you feel that you should be surprised at such deceptive teaching from evolutionists? Why or why not? Should we be surprised that they're trying to set forth these false things? That's right. As long as Satan can influence others away from God, is he? He will. As long as he can. In fact, Satan is after humans, is he not? You think about it. Satan knows he can't really get at God. He doesn't have the power to do it. So what does Satan do? How can he impact God? How can he cause God pain, we might say? Sorrow. Through his creation. Remember, we are made in the image of God. Well, Satan's actively trying to influence others away from God. And we see that in the school system today. Evolution is being taught. Creation's a no-no. Can't do it. Again, I mentioned the flying spaghetti monster. That was actually built as a response in Kansas. They were trying to get creation and evolution equal time in the classroom. So this guy invents this doctrine and comes through and says, yeah, that's fine, but you're also going to give my doctrine equal time as a way to refute intelligent design. And so he actually reversed the appeal that was there, and evolution continues. And all I can think of is Satan is there influencing. If you can believe in a doctrine that gets God out of the equation, what better way to deceive mankind? Well, let's conclude this. Evolutionary hoaxes. Now, with so many examples of evolution proven to be false, the Bible remains an ever-present example of truth and accuracy. We know it is in agreement with true science as well as history. In fact, we know there are scientists that are taking the Bible and using it as kind of a roadmap for the jobs that they do, and you know what they're finding? It's accurate. We can be good scientists with this information. This is a great book to help us with our job. Imagine that. Can you think back in Isaiah how the earth was described in one of the passages? You know which one I'm thinking of? What was it described? A circle. What did man believe for the longest time? The earth was flat. And yet you go clear back to Isaiah's time. We're talking 600, 700 years before Christ. While the common prevailing theme was the earth is flat. In fact, did we not have explorers that went to sail to find the end of the earth? And they find out, oh, eventually I get back to where I started. This must be circular. And yet, what do we find in the Bible? That wisdom, that science is there. Why is that the case? Who inspired the Bible? God did. God created these things. He knew these things. Man couldn't have possibly fabricated that. Furthermore, we wish to dispel falsehood and enlighten each and every person on the earth. Again, as Christians, is that not what we are to do? Go ye into all the world and do what? Preach and teach the gospel, baptizing in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. That is what we are. That's our mission as Christians, to teach them the truth. We're not in the business of falsehood. Now, Christ, in speaking of His opponents, stated in Matthew 13 and verse 15, I can't help but use this passage for this particular lesson to wrap it up. Now, this is a fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. Again, prophecy and the fulfillment of it, another wonderful testament to the inspiration of the Scriptures. Christ said, for this people's heart is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and should understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them. Now, what is the context of this passage? What is going on at this point in time? People are rejecting Christ, aren't they? They've seen the miracles, they've seen the power of God, they have no rational way to explain it except that He is God, supernatural things that took place, and yet what are they doing? I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. What do we have today? Same thing. People with evolution, they don't want to hear about creation. We're made fun of as Christians for believing that. Oh, you believe in God? Well, you're no better than somebody that believes in the tooth fairy. It's just make-believe, right? It's just a myth. But we're put in these different categories. They're the people that the heart is waxed gross, their ears are dull of hearing, their eyes have closed. Because if they actually saw the truth, they actually listened to the truth, it would do what with their heart? It would open it. It would do what with their eyes? They would open it. It would do what with their ears? It would open it. That's what we want to do as Christians, as followers of Christ. If only everyone would open their ears, would open their eyes to the truth of the gospel instead of inventing and believing falsehood. Can you imagine what this world would be like? People would just do that. I hope you're making plans to come back tomorrow night, Wednesday night. We're going to spend a whole night talking about dinosaurs. How many of you like dinosaurs? Yeah, we like dinosaurs. I remember as a kid, dinosaurs were it. And now that I have kids, I kept all those dinosaurs. Guess what they play with? I step on them all the time. There's dinosaurs everywhere. We like dinosaurs, at least most people do. But we're going to spend some time looking at dinosaurs, and we're going to see, do these really show evolution to be true, or are they a better proof for creation? I thank you all so very much. I think we ended just a little bit earlier tonight. Are there any questions, any thoughts, any comments? Robert. Yes. Thursday, we're going to look at that, the day-age theory, that gap theory. and that's largely theistic evolution. So what Robert's alluding to is the fact that you have some people that want to believe in evolution and believe in God. You know what happens when you hold on to two things that are diametrically opposed and they pull? You get ripped in two. And eventually we know from Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24, what's the end result? You can't serve both, can you? You need to serve God or mammon, the world, things of the world, evolution. You can't serve both. So yes, Thursday night's going to be dedicated largely to theistic evolution, at least in that particular case, because what the day-age theory, and not give too much away, because I want you to come back on Thursday, of course, is people try and fit a large quantity of time in the 6 days of creation. So that way they can allow for organic, really atheistic type evolution to take place and still have the Bible. Any other thoughts or comments, questions? Not, I thank you all so very much. And before too long, we'll wrap this up. Thank you.